Tai shouldered his way through the crowded station corridors, trying to ignore the rumble in his stomach. He'd skipped breakfast to save credits. Again, as he approached the auction hall entrance, he checked his balance one more time, hoping the numbers might somehow be different from when he'd checked 10 minutes ago. 312 credits stared back at him from the worn screen of his wrist unit. Not enough for a proper meal at the station's halfway decent eateries, let alone the parts he actually needed to keep his repair shop afloat. Just enough to be dangerous, he muttered to himself as the doors slid open with a hiss of compressed air. The auction hall was packed today. Salvage runs to the outer rim had been scarce lately, making today's offerings more valuable. Tai recognized most of the faces, the same scavengers, dealers, and mechanics who scratched out a living on this forgotten outpost of humanity. None of them spared him a glance as he slipped into his seat at the back. Jamin, his only real competition in the small repair business sector, nodded curtly from across the room. Their rivalry was professional but civil. Both knew there was barely enough work for one repair shop, let alone two. The auctioneer, a tall man with a prosthetic voice box that gave his words an unsettling mechanical quality, began the proceedings. Welcome to Outpost 47 Salvage Auction, standard date 22/87/45. All sales final. No returns, refunds, or exchanges. Bid at your own risk. The first 46 lots passed in a blur of technical jargon and rapidly escalating prices. Todd watched helplessly as useful items, power converters, navigation modules, even a nearly intact ship's AI core, all went for prices well beyond his meager budget. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his artificial voice somehow conveying boredom. Unidentified sealed cargo container, approximately 2 meters in length, recovered from debris field in the Cygnus Expanse. Minimum bid, 200 credits. The auction hall, normally filled with the low murmur of side conversations and bid planning, went suddenly quiet. Sealed containers were always a gamble, but ones from the Cygnus Expanse were particularly risky. The region was known for pirate activity, corporate skirmishes, and strange phenomena that defied explanation. Tai felt sweat break out on his forehead as he considered his options. He needed something, anything, to bring back to his shop. The past 3 months had been disastrous for business. Another week without new inventory, and he'd have to close permanently. Before he could talk himself out of it, his hand was in the air. 200, he called, trying to keep his voice steady. The auctioneer's mechanical gaze swept the room. 200 credits from number 83. Do I hear 250? Todd held his breath. If anyone else bid, he was out. He couldn't go higher. After an uncomfortably long pause, the auctioneer's voice box clicked. Sold to number 83 for 200 credits. A few people turned to look at him, with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Jadmin across the room made a cutting motion across his throat and shook his head. Great. Even his rival thought he'd made a terrible decision. Tai made his way to the payment terminal, feeling strangely lightheaded. He pressed his thumb against the scanner and winced as 2/3 of his total assets transferred away. The auction manager, a weather-beaten woman with eyes that had seen too many desperate gamblers, handed him the ownership chip. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of synthetic coffee. Your funeral, friend. What do you know about it? Tai asked, suddenly anxious. She shrugged. Nothing specific, but containers from the Expanse. 9 times out of 10, they're nothing but trouble. Quarantine violations, stolen property, sometimes worse. Worse how? 2 years back, some fool opened a similar container without scanning it first, released some kind of nano-weapon prototype, lost half a habitation ring before they contained it. She patted him on the shoulder. But hey, maybe you got lucky. Tai swallowed hard. Where can I pick it up? Bay 12. They're unloading it now. She hesitated. Word of advice. Run a full spectrum scan before you crack that thing open. Might save your life. The walk to Bay 12 felt longer than usual. Ta passed several food stalls, the aromas making his empty stomach protest loudly. He'd have to dip into his emergency reserves just to eat this week. The cargo handlers had already unloaded his purchase by the time he arrived. The container sat alone on the loading dock, unremarkable except for its perfect, unblemished surface. No manufacturer marks, no shipping codes, nothing to indicate its origin or contents. "Sign here," said the dock worker, thrusting a pad at him without looking up. "And get this thing out of here. It's giving off weird readings." Ty's heart skipped. What kind of readings? The worker finally looked up, annoyed. Faint energy signature. Inconsistent. Probably just a damaged power cell inside. But still, you should move it quickly. Ty hired a hover dolly with his last few credits and carefully loaded the container. As he guided it through the station corridors toward his small workshop, he noticed people giving him a wide berth. Word traveled fast on a station this size. Back at his workshop, Ty secured the door and dimmed the windows. He wasn't taking any chances. The container sat in the middle of his workspace, still and silent. Under the bright lights of his shop, he could see faint markings along one edge, symbols unlike any language he recognized. His scanner beeped as it detected the same energy signature the dock worker had mentioned. Faint, pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. Tay's hands trembled as he reached for his tools. Whatever was inside, it was worth more than the 200 credits he paid. It had to be. His future depended on it. Ta stared at the container for a long time before working up the courage to touch it. The surface felt cool and smooth, unlike any metal he'd encountered before. He ran his fingers along the edge, searching for seams or hinges. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "Let's see what I've bought." He pulled his toolkit closer and selected a scanner. The readings made no sense. The material wasn't registering as any known element. Ty switched tools, trying a different approach. 3 hours later, sweat dripped from his forehead as he carefully manipulated what appeared to be a locking mechanism. His back ached from hunching over the container. Twice he'd nearly given up, but each time he reminded himself that he had no other options. This container was all he had left. A soft click rewarded his patience. Ty jumped back as symbols across the container's surface began to glow with a pale blue light. The top portion of the container separated slightly, releasing a hiss of compressed air. "Please don't be poison gas," he muttered, holding his breath until his air quality monitor showed normal readings. Slowly, carefully, Ty opened the container wider. The blue glow intensified, illuminating his small workshop in an eerie light. Inside wasn't the spare parts or valuable metals he'd hoped for. Instead, there was what looked like a sleek metallic pod. A stasis chamber. He blinked in surprise. Such technology existed, but was rare and incredibly expensive, used only for the wealthiest travelers on long-distance journeys. The pod's surface was covered in flowing script, delicate symbols that curved and connected in patterns that somehow looked both mathematical and artistic. Taz's translator implant hummed in his ear, trying and failing to make sense of the writing. He leaned closer, wiping condensation from the pod's viewing panel. Through the frosted surface, he could make out a humanoid shape. His heart raced. Human trafficking was rare these days, but not unheard of. "What have I gotten myself into?" he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty workshop. The pod had what appeared to be a control panel at one end. Among the strange symbols was a circular depression that pulsed with gentle light. Ta hesitated, then pressed it. A low hum filled the room as the pod's systems activated. The script along its surface brightened, sequences of symbols lighting up and fading in patterns that suggested some kind of boot sequence. The viewing panel cleared, becoming transparent. Ta gasped. Inside was a young woman, or at least a being that looked remarkably like a human woman. Her skin had a pale blue tint, and her hair was silver, not the gray of age, but a metallic, flowing silver that seemed to shimmer even in stasis. The cover of the pod began to retract, sliding soundlessly into the base. Cool mist rolled out and across the floor of the workshop. Ta stepped back, unsure whether to run for help or stay. Before he could decide, the woman's eyes fluttered open. Tai nearly fell backward in shock. Her eyes were entirely black, except for tiny points of light within them, like stars in a night sky. She blinked, focusing on him. In an instant, her expression changed from confusion to fear. She sat up suddenly, pressing herself against the far end of the pod, speaking rapidly in a language unlike anything Tai had ever heard. His translator implant whirred uselessly, unable to find any linguistic patterns to match. The woman's voice was melodic, almost musical, rising and falling in complex patterns that seemed to contain more information than simple speech should. Tai raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said slowly. The woman stopped speaking, studying him intensely. Her star-filled eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head in a gesture that seemed both alien and familiar. "I'm Todd," he said, pointing to himself. Then, remembering old first contact protocols from history lessons, he added, "You're safe." She watched him carefully, then mimicked his gesture, pointing to herself. What came out was a sound Tai couldn't possibly reproduce, a complex chord that seemed to contain multiple tones at once. Tai tried to smile reassuringly, though his mind was racing. He'd expected junk, or at best, salvageable parts. Instead, he'd found what appeared to be a non-human sentient being. The station authorities would need to be notified. There would be quarantine protocols, diplomatic procedures. The woman shivered, drawing Ta's attention back to the moment. Despite her alien appearance, the gesture was so human that it snapped him out of his thoughts. He reached for a thermal blanket kept in his emergency kit and slowly offered it to her. She studied it for a moment, then cautiously reached out. Her fingers were long and slender, with an extra joint that allowed them to bend in ways human fingers couldn't. When she touched the blanket, she made a soft sound of surprise at its warmth and pulled it around her shoulders. Ta's comm unit buzzed. The station security automated sweep. They monitored unusual energy signatures as a matter of routine. If they detected the pod, making a split-second decision, Tai reached over and shut down his workshop's power grid. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow from the pod and the woman's starlit eyes. "Sorry," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand him. "But I think we need to keep you a secret for now, at least until I figure out what's going on." In the dim blue light, the woman watched him with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been fear. Ta had no idea what he was going to do next, but one thing was certain: his life had just become infinitely more complicated than a mere shortage of credits. Ta sat cross-legged on the floor of his workshop, watching with undisguised amazement as Neri's long fingers moved across the internal components of his repair drone. 2 weeks ago, the drone had been barely functional, good only for carrying small parts around the workshop. Now, under her guidance, it was becoming something else entirely. "You're sure this won't trigger any security alerts?" he asked, keeping his voice low despite the signal jammers he'd installed around the workshop. Neri didn't look up from her work. "Your station systems are." She paused, searching for the right word. "Primitive. They will not detect these modifications." Her speech had improved dramatically. In just 14 days, she had gone from incomprehensible musical tones to broken phrases to near-fluent conversation. Ta still didn't understand how her species could learn languages so quickly. Just one of many mysteries about her. "Done," she announced, closing the drone's access panel. The small machine hummed to life, its lights glowing a soft blue similar to Neri's skin tone. "How's that?" Ta picked up his control pad and tested the drone's functions. His eyes widened as the machine responded with speed and precision it had never possessed before. It hovered silently, something it had never been able to do with its old propulsion system. "Amazing," he replied, examining the new command options appearing on his screen. "Where did you learn to do this?" Nari tucked a strand of silver hair behind her ear, a gesture she had picked up from watching him. "My people are engineers," she explained, sitting back on her heels. I was junior scientist on research vessel when we were attacked. Todd lowered the control pad. It was the first time she had volunteered information about what had happened to her. He'd been careful not to press, aware of how disoriented and frightened she had been upon awakening. Attacked by who? He asked gently. Neri's star-filled eyes dimmed slightly. We do not know their name. Dark ships. They came without warning. She made a gesture with her hands that somehow conveyed explosion and destruction better than words could. My team put me in safety pod. Emergency protocol. Ta nodded, thinking of the stasis pod now hidden beneath the false floor of his storage room. How long were you in there? Pod's chronometer indicated. She closed her eyes, converting time measurements. Approximately 3 of your years. 3 years floating in space. The thought made Ta's stomach tighten. He'd spent a week in emergency isolation once after a maintenance accident. Even that had nearly driven him to madness. Are there others? More of your people in pods? He asked. Neri shook her head. I do not know. Communication systems were damaged. Her shoulders slumped slightly. I may be only survivor. Todd wanted to offer comfort but wasn't sure how. In the 2 weeks they'd spent together, he'd learned that her people had different physical boundaries than humans. Touch had specific meanings in her culture. Instead, he nodded toward the drone. Show me what else it can do now. Her expression brightened as she took the control pad from him. The drone responded to her commands with almost lifelike responsiveness, performing maneuvers that should have been impossible with its basic hardware. I added interface with your workshop systems, she explained. Drone can now retrieve tools, organize inventory, perform basic repairs. You did all that with the junk parts I had lying around. She made a sound that he had come to recognize as laughter, a melodic trill that always made him smile in response. Your junk contains many useful components. Humans discard too easily. The reality of their situation sometimes hit Ty in waves. Here he was, a struggling repair shop owner on a forgotten station, sitting across from a being from another world. A being whose technological understanding made human advancements look like children's toys. His stomach growled, interrupting his thoughts. Neri tilted her head in that bird-like manner of hers. Time for nutrition, she stated. Another human habit she'd adopted, announcing mealtimes like they were scheduled ship operations. They moved to the small living area attached to his workshop. Ta had little in terms of food supplies, but through careful experimentation, they discovered that Neri could safely consume most human proteins and some carbohydrates. Fruits caused an allergic reaction, and anything spicy made her hiccup uncontrollably for hours. As they shared a simple meal of synthesized rice and protein cubes, Ta noticed Neri watching him with an unusual intensity. Is something wrong? He asked. She seemed to consider her words carefully. On my world, when one being saves another's life, they are connected. She tentatively reached across the table and touched his hand. Thank you for not selling me to authorities. The touch startled him. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. Her skin was cooler than human temperature, and it tingled slightly against his, like a mild electric current. I may be a salvager, but I'm not a monster, Tay replied, suddenly aware of how much her presence had changed his solitary life. The workshop that had once felt empty and quiet now felt alive with possibility. He didn't pull his hand away. What would happen if the authorities found you? Best outcome. I become research subject. Worst outcome. She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. No one will find you, Ta promised. Not while I can help it. Neri's eyes brightened, the star-like points within them seeming to twinkle. Tomorrow I will show you how to modify your door security. Make it better. I'd like that. Ta smiled, realizing that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The sharp, rhythmic pounding on the workshop door cut through the quiet evening like gunshots. Ta dropped the component he was working on, his body freezing in instant alarm. Across the room, Neri looked up from the datapad she had been studying, her star-filled eyes widening. Security override in progress, announced the automated system as the door's access panel began flashing red. Tay rushed to the security feed. The screen showed 5 figures outside his door, 2 wearing the gray uniforms of station security, but the other 3 wore black suits with no insignia or markings. Their faces were expressionless, professional. One held equipment Tay recognized as advanced scanning technology, far beyond standard station issue. Someone talked, he whispered, his mind racing through possibilities. Jamin, the dock worker, the auction manager. It didn't matter now. We need to leave. Neri was already moving, gathering the few possessions she had accumulated during her stay. The emergency plan, she said calmly, though Tay could see the points of light in her eyes pulsing rapidly with what he now recognized as fear. They had discussed this possibility many times. Tay grabbed a small bag containing emergency supplies and their identification chips. He pressed a hidden panel on the wall, revealing a maintenance tunnel that ran behind the residential units. Warning: security breach imminent, the system announced as the door's locking mechanism began to give way. Tay sealed the hidden panel behind them, just as they heard the workshop door slam open. The maintenance tunnel was dark and narrow, designed for repair drones rather than people. They moved as quickly as they could in a hunched position, Neri's natural night vision guiding them through turns Tay could barely see. The landing bay is 3 sections ahead, Tay whispered, wincing as his head scraped against a low-hanging pipe. The tunnel ended at a utility access panel. Tay peered through before pushing it open. The landing bay seemed relatively empty, just a few cargo handlers working at the far end. His ship, the Songbird, sat in docking slip 17, looking small and vulnerable compared to the cargo vessels surrounding it. Quick and casual, Tay reminded Neri, pulling a cap low over her silver hair. With her hood up and face down, she could pass for human at a distance. They stepped out of the access panel and walked purposefully toward the Songbird. Tay nodded to a passing dock worker who barely glanced at them. Just another ship owner and assistant heading out for a routine salvage run. They were 20 meters from the ship when Tay's personal communicator vibrated. He almost ignored it, but something made him check the screen. It was a station-wide alert, the highest priority level. Attention, all citizens. Report any sightings of unauthorized alien LIFEF ORNS MMEDATLI. Level 1 QARNTINE por autociolas in EFFECT. All DPA or QRES TMPORARILYSUVs expanded. As if on cue, warning lights began flashing throughout the bay, and the massive docking bay doors began to close. Run, Tay said, abandoning all pretense of casualness. They sprinted the remaining distance to the Songbird. Tay slammed his palm against the entry scanner, and the ship's ramp lowered agonizingly slowly. Behind them, shouts echoed across the bay as dock security spotted their sudden movement. "Stop right there," a voice commanded over the bay's announcement system. They tumbled into the ship, and Tay hit the emergency ramp retraction as he scrambled toward the cockpit. The Songbird systems were already coming online. Neri must have remotely activated the startup sequence. "They're sealing the bay doors," Neri reported, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. "We have 45 seconds before complete closure." Tay's hands flew over the controls, bypassing safety protocols and warming checks. "We'll never make it. The engines aren't ready for full thrust." Neri reached across him and pressed her palms flat against the main control panel. Her eyes closed in concentration, and to Tay's amazement, the ship's displays flickered, then stabilized with a new intensity. The engine readout jumped from 30% to 95% in seconds. "What are you doing?" Tay asked, staring as the normally temperamental systems of his salvage vessel responded like a high-end military craft. "Showing you what my people can do," she replied, her voice strained with effort. "Fly now. Explanations later." Tay didn't need to be told twice. He engaged thrusters at full power, and the songbird leaped forward with a surge of energy he'd never felt from the old ship before. They shot toward the narrowing gap of the bay doors. "We're not going to fit," Tom muttered, but he didn't reduce speed. "We will," Nari assured him, her hands still connected to the panel. The ship's external geometry displays showed impossible numbers, as if the songbird was somehow becoming slightly narrower. They scraped through the gap with centimeters to spare, metal screaming against metal for a heart-stopping moment before they burst into open space. Alarms immediately blared on the communications panel. "Unscheduled departure detected. Return to station immediately or face defensive measures," came the automated warning. Through the viewport, Ty could see patrol ships already launching from the station's security base. Newer, faster vessels designed to intercept smugglers and pirates. "They'll catch us in minutes," Ta said, plotting an evasive course nonetheless. The songbird had never been built for speed. Neri didn't respond verbally. Instead, her fingers spread wider on the control panel, silvery filaments extending from her fingertips to merge with the ship's systems. The lights in the cockpit dimmed momentarily, then strengthened to a bright blue glow. The engine noise changed from its familiar rumble to a higher-pitched hum. The stars outside began to streak as the songbird accelerated to speeds Ty had never imagined possible from his patched-together vessel. "How are you doing this?" he asked, watching in amazement as the pursuit ships fell behind on the scanner. Neri opened her eyes, the star points within them blazing brighter than Ty had ever seen. "My people evolved to connect with technology. We can communicate with it, enhance it." She smiled faintly. "Your ship has much potential. It just needed the right conversation." On the scanner, the patrol ships were attempting to match their speed without success. The station itself was now just a diminishing point of light behind them. "Where should we go?" Ty asked, suddenly realizing he had no plan beyond escape. Nari gently removed her hands from the panel, leaving faint glowing imprints that slowly faded. "I have coordinates," she said softly. "A place where my people may have survived." Ty looked at her in surprise. "You remember? I thought your memory was damaged." "It was," she confirmed. "But working with your technology has helped me recover fragments. I believe I can guide us to a sanctuary." Ta hesitated only briefly before entering the navigational controls. Everything he had ever known was now behind him. His shop, his meager possessions, his precarious but familiar life. Ahead lay only uncertainty with this mysterious being he'd known for mere weeks. Yet somehow, it felt right. "Let's go find your people," he said, setting the course. Tai tugged at the collar of his formal jacket, a garment so new and expensive that it made him uncomfortable just wearing it. 6 months ago, he had been counting credits to buy cheap protein packs. Now he stood in clothing made of materials he couldn't even name, aboard a ship larger than some space stations he'd visited. "Stop fidgeting," Nari said gently, reaching over to straighten his collar. "You look fine." She had changed too. Gone was the frightened, disoriented being who had emerged from a stasis pod in his workshop. In her place stood a confident representative of her people, the Hani. Her silver hair was arranged in complex patterns that signified her status as a scientist, and her ceremonial robes flowed around her like liquid metal, changing colors subtly as she moved. Their journey to find her people had been long and dangerous. 3 close encounters with patrol ships, a nerve-wracking passage through a disputed sector, and finally, the discovery of a hidden communications relay that Nari had used to send a message in her native language. For weeks afterward, they had drifted in empty space, waiting for a response, living on dwindling supplies and hope. When the Hani ship had finally appeared, it had done so silently, simply existing where empty space had been moments before. The vessel dwarfed anything in the human fleet, its pearlescent surface seeming to both absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. Now they waited outside the council chamber, where the leaders of the Hani would decide the future of human-Hani relations. Tay's stomach twisted with anxiety. "Are you sure they'll listen?" he asked Nari for perhaps the 10th time. "I'm just a salvager," not a diplomat or scientist. They will, she assured him, taking his hand. Her touch still carried that slight electrical tingle that he had grown to find comforting. You saved me when you could have exploited me. You showed me kindness when you could have shown fear. My people have watched humanity for decades, uncertain if you were ready for contact. Ta looked down at their joined hands. I just did what seemed right. Exactly, Neri said with a smile. That is why you are the perfect ambassador. You acted from character, not protocol. The massive doors before them began to part, sliding soundlessly into the walls. Light spilled out from the chamber beyond, not the harsh artificial lighting of human stations, but something softer, more natural, like captured starlight. Neri squeezed his hand once more before releasing it. Remember, keep your thoughts clear and focused. My people can sense emotional states. Great, Ta muttered. So they'll know exactly how terrified I am. They will respect your courage in facing that fear, she replied. Together, they stepped into the council chamber. Ta had seen images of the room during their preparation, but nothing compared to experiencing it firsthand. The chamber was circular, with a domed ceiling that somehow showed the actual space outside the ship, as if the structure were transparent. The effect was breathtaking. Standing beneath the endless stars while surrounded by the soft glow of the chamber's interior lighting. Around the perimeter stood 12 Hani, each wearing ceremonial attire that indicated their guild or specialty. Their star-filled eyes were all fixed on Tai, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. In the center of the room was a raised platform with a single object, the stasis pod that had brought Neri to him, now restored and gleaming as if new. One of the Hani stepped forward from the circle. Unlike the others, whose skin ranged from pale blue to violet, this elder's skin had a silvery cast that seemed to catch and reflect the starlight from above. The markings on their robes indicated great age and wisdom. Neri of the Scientific Guild has shared her experiences among humans, the elder said, their voice carrying the same musical quality as Neri's but deeper, more resonant. One human's compassion has given us hope for meaningful alliance. The elder approached Tai, stopping just a few steps away. I am Soren, first voice of the Hani Council. We have observed your species for many cycles, uncertain if the time was right for contact. Tai swallowed hard, remembering the careful coaching Neri had given him about Hani customs. He bowed his head slightly, showing respect without submission. The rescue of Neri was not planned, he said, his voice steadier than he expected. But I'm grateful for the accident that brought her to my workshop. Soren made a gesture with their long fingers that Neri had taught him meant acknowledgement and approval. There are no accidents in the great pattern, Tai of Earth. Your actions revealed a truth about humanity that our observations had not captured. Another council member stepped forward. Not all humans would have acted as you did. Many would have surrendered Neri to authorities or sought to profit from her knowledge. Yes, Tai agreed, seeing no point in denying it. Humans are complicated. We're capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same person. This candid assessment seemed to please the council. Several members exchanged glances and made the gesture of acknowledgement. Soren moved to the stasis pod at the center of the room. This vessel protected one of our own when we believed all was lost. Now it serves as a symbol of connection between our peoples. They placed a hand on its smooth surface. The attack that separated Neri from us was not an isolated incident. A shadow moves through the stars, threatening all sentient life. Neri stepped forward, joining Ta. I've told Tai about the attacks. About the dark ships. Soren nodded gravely. They grow bolder. 3 Hani outposts have gone silent in recent cycles, and now we have detected their scout vessels near human colonies. Todd felt a chill run through him. You're saying Earth is in danger. All life that thinks and dreams is in danger, Soren replied. Alone, neither of our peoples can stand against what comes. Together, perhaps there is hope. The elder extended both hands, palms up, in the Hani gesture of formal alliance offering. We offer knowledge, technology, and protection. In return, we ask for partnership, for the unique perspective that humanity brings to the stars. Todd looked at Neri, who nodded encouragingly. He stepped forward and placed his hands above Soren's, not quite touching, just as Neri had taught him. On behalf of humanity, he said, the gravity of the moment almost overwhelming, I accept your offer of alliance. As he spoke, the stasis pod began to glow, illuminating the chamber with brilliant blue light. The stars above seemed to pulse in response, as if the cosmos itself witnessed this moment. Tay, once a struggling salvager who had spent his last credits on what he thought was space junk, now stood at the beginning of humanity's greatest adventure. As he looked around at the Hani Council, at Neri's proud face, at the vastness of space above them, he couldn't help but smile at the absurdity and wonder of it all. Sometimes, he thought, the most valuable things in the universe come disguised as space junk.